She walked into the most dangerous trauma unit in the state, carrying a worn military duffel and 10 years of secrets she wasn't allowed to speak. The doctors laughed. A senior surgeon pointed at her and said, loud enough for the entire floor to hear, "Someone tell me why there's a lost nursing student standing in my trauma bay." The room laughed with him. What they didn't know, what none of them could have known, was that the woman standing quietly in the doorway had once pulled 3 soldiers out of a burning extraction site with her bare hands while enemy fire tore through the walls around her. She didn't correct them. She just lowered her gaze, stepped aside, and waited. Because she hadn't come to prove anything. She had come to stop a murder. If this story grabs you from the first second, stay with me until the very end. Hit that like button, drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from right now. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Let's go. The rain had been hammering Greywood for 3 days straight. It came down in sheets so heavy that the gutters on Alderman Street had long since given up, and the water just pooled across the asphalt in wide black mirrors that reflected the emergency lights of every passing ambulance. It was the kind of weather that made the city feel like it was holding its breath, like something bad was already happening, and the sky knew it before anyone else did. Mercy Crest Medical Center sat at the edge of Greywood's financial district, 17 floors of steel and glass that had been rebuilt twice in the last 30 years and earned a national ranking both times. The kind of hospital that had a donor wall in the lobby and a public relations team that managed its reputation like a political campaign. Gleaming from the outside, complicated on the inside. The trauma department on the 4th floor had a reputation that ran ahead of it in medical circles. Faster response times than the city average. A chief surgeon who had been profiled in 3 separate journals, and a staff culture that could generously be described as competitive and honestly be described as brutal. The ambulance bay doors opened at 6:47 in the evening. A woman walked in out of the rain. She was 31 years old, white, medium height, with dark circles under her eyes that hadn't come from one bad night, but from a pattern of them. She wore standard-issue Navy scrubs and a hospital ID badge that had been issued just 4 days earlier. Her name tag said Carter, A. Alexandra Carter, registered nurse, newly transferred from a regional facility 2 states west that nobody at Mercy Crest had ever heard of. She carried a military surplus duffel that was clearly old, clearly hers, and clearly not the kind of bag anyone brought to a shift. She stood just inside the ambulance bay doors and looked at the floor plan on the wall, orienting herself without making a production of it. That was when Dr. Marcus Vale noticed her. Vale was the kind of surgeon who walked into a room and immediately recalibrated everything around himself. He was 44, classically trained, Harvard residency, and had spent enough years being treated like the most important person in any given space that he'd stopped questioning whether it was true. He had a way of looking at people that communicated, in the span of about 2 seconds, exactly where he ranked them. He looked at Alexandra Carter. He ranked her. "Somebody going to help the new girl find pediatrics?" he said, loud and easy, the way someone delivers a joke they're already certain will land. It landed. 2 residents laughed. A charge nurse smiled despite herself. Someone across the bay didn't bother hiding it. Alexandra didn't react. She turned from the floor plan, glanced at the badge scanner beside the trauma door, and pressed her ID to it. The light went green. She pushed through. Vale watched her go with mild amusement and then returned to the chart in his hand, already forgetting about her. That was his first mistake. The trauma department at Mercy Crest was organized in a horseshoe shape. 3 acute bays in the center, a corridor of monitored rooms on the east side, a nurse's station at the curve of the horseshoe, and a supply corridor running along the back wall that connected trauma to the surgical prep area. Alexandra had read the floor plan twice before she arrived. She knew where the crash carts were, where the secondary medication cabinet sat, and which camera in the northeast corner had a 30-second refresh lag that created a blind spot between the supply corridor and the stairwell door. She had done her homework. She found her assigned locker in the staff area, stored the duffel, and pulled on a second badge, the one that marked her as trauma nursing, general staff. Then she walked back out onto the floor and introduced herself to the charge nurse with the quiet, slightly deferential energy of someone who was new and knew it. The charge nurse was a woman named Britta Solano, 50-something, sharp eyes, zero patience for drama, but a practical fairness about her that Alexandra recognized immediately as the real authority on this floor, regardless of what the org chart said. Britta looked her over, asked 2 direct questions about her IV certification and her experience with arterial lines, got 2 direct answers, and then handed her a patient assignment list. Bays 2 through 4 until 10, Britta said. Dr. Vale's team tonight. Stay out of his way unless he asks. Understood. Britta paused, like she was about to add something, then decided not to. She turned back to the monitor. Alexandra took her list and started moving. The first 2 hours were textbook. She worked fast and clean. Vitals, assessments, documentation, handoffs. She didn't cut corners, and she didn't perform. When a second-year resident named Okonkwo fumbled an IV placement on a patient coming in from a car accident and started to spiral into visible embarrassment, she stepped in beside him, corrected the angle without drawing attention to the correction, and kept moving. Okonkwo gave her a look of startled gratitude. She didn't acknowledge it. There was no time and no point. She was scanning the room constantly, not nervously, professionally. The kind of steady environmental awareness that most people in that building had never needed to develop because they had never been in environments where missing something got someone killed. At 8:15, a transport team came through the trauma corridor with a guarded patient. 2 plainclothes security officers flanked a gurney carrying a man in his late 50s, big-framed, with a jaw that looked like it had been set through considerable force at some point in the past. He had 2 IV lines already running and a blood pressure cuff cycling every few minutes. His face was slack, but his eyes, even in the haze of pain medication, were the kind of eyes that had learned to track exits in unfamiliar spaces. Alexandra watched from the nurses' station as they moved him into the monitored room at the far end of the east corridor. She watched the door close. She watched one of the security officers take up position outside it, and the other disappear, presumably to the facility's security office, to coordinate with hospital personnel. She looked at the transfer paperwork that had been routed to the charge station. Patient, Colonel Warren Briggs, military liaison, admitted under protective protocol. Surgical recovery, post-abdominal repair. Restricted access. She read it once. She didn't react. She put the paperwork down and went back to Bay 3, where a 50-year-old man with a broken radius was asking for his third update on when he'd be going upstairs. Dr. Marcus Vale held court at Mercy Crest the way certain men hold court everywhere, by filling the available space with enough confidence and technical authority that no one thinks to question the edges of it. He was good at his job. That part wasn't up for debate. His outcomes were exceptional, and he had the data to prove it. What he was less good at was the distinction between being skilled and being right about everything, which he had gradually stopped making over the years until the 2 things had fused together in his mind into one unbroken conviction. He came back to the trauma floor at 9 o'clock for a secondary consult and found Alexandra at the medication dispensary. You the transfer from, where was it, somewhere in Nebraska? Kansas, she said. Regional facility outside Wichita. He nodded the way someone nods when information confirms something unflattering they already believed. How long you been in trauma nursing? 4 years? He reached past her for a chart. Trauma at a regional facility and trauma here are different in ways you probably haven't run into yet. Different pace, different stakes. You're going to want to stay in your lane for a while, observe how we do things, before you start making any judgment calls. She looked at him. Of course. I mean that practically, not as an insult. This isn't the place to figure things out on the job. I understand, Dr. Vale. He studied her for a moment, apparently trying to determine if she was being sarcastic. Her expression gave him nothing to work with. He took the chart and left. She watched him go. Then she turned back to the medication dispensary and looked at the log on the screen. She had noticed it 20 minutes earlier. A dispensary record for a controlled sedative that had been accessed at 6:30, half an hour before Colonel Briggs had been brought in, by a staff ID that didn't match the dosage order in the system. A small discrepancy. The kind that could be a documentation error or a data entry slip. She wrote the ID number on the inside of her forearm in pen. Then she closed out of the screen and went back to her patients. It was just after 10 when the shift dynamics changed. A trauma activation came in. A construction worker who had fallen 4 stories onto a metal scaffold brace and survived it, which was its own kind of miracle. But the resulting injuries were complex, and Vale's team mobilized fast. The floor shifted into the controlled urgency that serious trauma produces. Quick voices, deliberate movement, people knowing their roles. Alexandra worked Bay 2 on a separate patient, an elderly woman brought in for a suspected stroke who was stabilizing well. From Bay 2, she had a clear line of sight to the supply corridor entrance. At 10:22, she saw a hospital employee she didn't recognize come through the supply corridor door. He was wearing scrubs and a Mercy Crest badge, moving with the unhurried ease of someone who belonged there. 30s, lean, with the kind of resting composure that isn't relaxed but controlled. He carried a medical supply tray and turned toward the east corridor. Toward the rooms. Toward the room at the end of the east corridor. Alexandra finished the vitals check on her patient, documented it, and walked to the nurses' station where she pulled up the staff directory on the terminal. She entered the partial badge number she had managed to read from across the room. The name that came up was Seth Coburn. Supply and Logistics, day shift. Day shift. It was 10:22 at night. She stood at the terminal for a moment, then turned and walked calmly in the direction of the east corridor. The security officer outside Briggs's room, the one who had stayed on post, was a broad-shouldered man named, according to his badge, Harmon. He was professional, alert, clearly experienced. He saw Alexandra coming and straightened slightly. "Nurse," he said, "I have a medication check for the patient in the monitored room." "Not on my authorization list. Hold on." He reached for his radio. She waited. She was watching the corridor behind him. The door to the room was closed. The supply tray man, Coburn, was not visible, which meant he had gone somewhere past this point, which was a problem because there were only 3 places past this point, and one of them was room 14, and one of them was the linen closet, and one of them was the fire door to the stairwell. Harmon spoke into the radio, waited, frowned slightly at whatever came back. "They say no medication scheduled. Can you double-check with the floor physician?" she said. "There may have been a verbal order not entered yet." Harmon reached for the radio again. Alexandra turned, walked back toward the nurse's station at a normal pace, turned the corner out of Harmon's line of sight, and immediately moved to the stairwell access at the north end of the corridor. The other stairwell, the one that ran parallel. She took the stairs to the service level, moved through a utility corridor, and came up through a supply access that opened 40 feet from the fire door. The fire door was propped open with a rubber wedge. She stood still for a moment. Then she took out her phone, sent a text to a number that was not in her contacts list by name, and typed, "Package compromised. Location, East Corridor stairwell. Need eyes now." She put the phone back. Then she pushed the fire door open with her shoulder and went through. The stairwell between the 4th and 5th floors of Mercy Crest was utilitarian, bare concrete, industrial lighting, the kind of space that exists in every large building and that almost nobody pays attention to precisely because it's designed to be invisible. It smelled of cleaning solution and dust. Coburn was on the landing above her. He had his back to the door and he was working at something mounted to the underside of the 5th floor landing, a small rectangular object, matte black, that he was attaching to the structural railing with what looked like industrial adhesive strips. His movements were deliberate and unhurried. He had done this kind of thing before, or something like it. Alexandra stayed at the base of the landing. She didn't announce herself. She studied the object, the placement, the angle. Her mind ran calculations that had nothing to do with nursing. Then she said quietly, "Supply and logistics runs 24 hours?" Coburn spun around. For 1 second his face was pure alarm, the animal shock of being caught in the absolute wrong place doing the absolute wrong thing. Then something shuddered behind his eyes, and he put on a different face, the face of someone who has a cover story ready and is deciding whether to use it. "Medication restock," he said. "Some of us work late." "What's that?" she said, looking at the object on the railing. "Sensor housing, building maintenance. Your logistics, not facilities. Cross-department coverage." She held his gaze. He held hers. Something passed between them that had nothing to do with words, a mutual recognition, the kind that happens when 2 people who know how dangerous the world actually is find themselves in a quiet stairwell at 10:30 at night, both calculating. "You should go back to your floor," he said. His voice had changed. Not threatening exactly. Informational. "So should you," she said. Neither of them moved. Then her phone vibrated twice in her pocket, the signal she'd been waiting for. She kept her eyes on Coburn and said without looking away, "They're already in the building." His face changed. It was subtle. A compression around the jaw, a stillness that replaced the calculated calm. But she had learned to read faces in conditions that made subtlety the only available language, and she read his clearly. He didn't know who they were, which meant he was not the top of this, which meant there was someone above him who had set this in motion and who, right now, was somewhere in Mercy Crest Hospital while Colonel Warren Briggs lay in room 14 recovering from surgery, and the only person on this floor who understood the full shape of what was happening was standing in a stairwell in nursing scrubs with a hospital ID and no weapon. Coburn made his decision. He moved toward the fire door. She stepped into his path. "Don't," she said. "You don't want to do this," he told her, and his voice had dropped into something that was not a threat, but was adjacent to one. The kind of tone that tells you the person speaking has a threshold and you're standing on it. "The device on the railing," she said. "What's the delivery mechanism? Aerosol or electrical?" That stopped him, because that was not a question a nurse asked. He stared at her, and in his stare she could see him recalculating everything. The transfer paperwork, the quiet Midwestern hospital, the woman he had dismissed as background, and coming up with an entirely different answer than the one he'd started with. "Who are you?" he said. She didn't answer. Above them, from the direction of the fourth floor, they heard the unmistakable sound of a door opening and then voices. More than one, moving fast. And one of them was using a frequency and cadence that hospital personnel didn't use. The clipped brevity of people who communicated under operational conditions. Coburn heard it too. He looked at the fire door. He looked at the stairwell above. He looked at Alexandra. And then the lights went out. Not a flicker. Not a brief outage. A complete floor-wide cut that dropped the stairwell into absolute black for 3 full seconds before the emergency backup lighting kicked in, red-orange and insufficient, painting the concrete in the color of a bad dream. In those 3 seconds, 2 things happened. The first was that Coburn moved. She felt rather than saw it, the displacement of air and the scrape of a heel on concrete, and she moved with him, not to stop him, but to track him, her hand catching the railing to orient herself in the dark. He hit the fire door with his shoulder, and it swung open into the corridor, and she heard him running. The second thing that happened was that from the floor above, someone shouted one word in a voice that cut through the emergency lighting and the sound of running and the distant alarm that had started somewhere in the building. A voice that she recognized. Not from Mercy Crest, from somewhere much further back, from a burning field site in a country she was not allowed to name, on a night that had never officially happened. The word they shouted was her name. Not Carter, not her cover name, her real name. The one she hadn't heard spoken aloud in 4 years. She stood in the red-lit stairwell with the emergency alarm cycling through the building, and for the first time since she had walked through the ambulance bay doors into the laughter of people who thought they knew exactly what she was, her expression changed. Not fear, not relief. Something older than either. The particular settling that happens in a person who has been carrying something alone for a very long time and has just heard proof that they are no longer carrying it alone. She pulled the fire door open and went back into the corridor, down the east hall, past the nurses' station where Britta Solano was already on the phone coordinating the power situation, past the security post where Harmon had moved away from the door with his hand on his radio, toward room 14, where the door was now standing open, and the 2 plainclothes officers who had brought Briggs in were standing in the frame. And inside the room, in the red-orange emergency light, Colonel Warren Briggs was sitting up in the hospital bed. He was conscious. I was looking directly at her. And on his face, as she stepped into the doorway, was an expression she had no time to interpret, because behind her, from the nurses' station, Britta Solano's voice cut through the alarm. "Security to East Corridor. Now. We have an unauthorized device in the building." And then everything in Mercy Crest Hospital began to move at once. The alarm was the kind that didn't negotiate. It cycled in 3-second bursts through the entire 4th floor. A flat, industrial wail that stripped the air of anything soft and replaced it with urgency. The emergency lighting held the corridor in that washed-out amber that makes everything look like it happened a long time ago, and the staff who had been moving with purpose 30 seconds earlier were now moving with a different kind of purpose, the reactive kind, the kind that comes when the environment stops being predictable. Alexandra was already at the door of room 14. Briggs was sitting upright in the hospital bed, both hands gripping the rail, his face pale but his eyes entirely clear. The pain medication hadn't taken the soldier out of him. It had just put a layer of gauze over it, and right now the gauze was off. "You're Carter," he said. Not a question. You need to stay in this room, she said. Someone want to tell me what's on that railing in the stairwell? She looked at the two security officers still bracketing the doorway. The one named Harmon had his radio up and was getting fragments of broken transmission. The power cut had disrupted the building's communication relay, and everything coming through was partial, interrupted, unreliable. The second officer, younger, was watching Alexandra with the specific alertness of someone trying to determine if she was an asset or a problem. We have an unauthorized device in the north stairwell, 4th to 5th landing, she said. Male suspect fled into the corridor approximately 90 seconds ago. Medium build, dark scrubs, badge identifying as Seth Coburn, supply and logistics. That badge is either stolen or issued under a false identity. Harmon stared at her. How do you know that? I saw him place it. You should have called it in immediately instead of, I did call it in. She held his gaze. The text went out before I followed him. Check your relay when the system comes back up. He didn't have a response to that. He turned to his radio and tried again, getting slightly better signal this time, enough to relay the description. Alexandra moved past him into the room and went to the window. Not to look out, but to check the latch mechanism on the frame. Old building detail. The monitored rooms on the east side had windows that could be opened from the outside with the right equipment, if the magnetic seal was disrupted during a power event. The seal was intact. She stepped back. You need to move him, she said, turning to Harmon. Not upstairs. The device placement suggests the 5th floor is part of this. Ground level, internal room, no exterior walls. That's not your call. Then make it yours, right now. Harmon looked at Briggs. Briggs looked at Alexandra with that same unreadable expression he'd had when she walked in, and then he looked at Harmon and said, Move me. The logistics of moving a post-surgical patient during a partial power failure while an alarm cycled overhead, and 60 other staff members were trying to manage their own patients and protocols, was not a clean operation. It was not supposed to be. Nothing real ever was. Britta Solano appeared at the door of room 14 with the expression of a woman who had been managing crises for 25 years and was prepared to manage one more, but would prefer a briefing first. She took in the scene, Harmon on the radio, Briggs upright in the bed, Alexandra standing near the window with a particular stillness that clearly registered as wrong to someone with Britta's instincts. Carter, Britta said. Explain. Unauthorized personnel placed a device in the north stairwell. Suspect fled. I've relayed the description to security. The patient needs to be moved to an interior room on the ground floor as a precautionary measure pending device assessment. Britta absorbed this. You followed a suspect into the stairwell. Yes. Alone. Yes. A beat. Then Britta said, Get me a transport chair, and turned to the corridor to find one herself because waiting for someone to bring it was not how Britta Solano operated. That was the thing about competent people in a crisis. They didn't ask who was in charge. They identified what needed to happen and made it happen. Alexandra had been watching for that quality since she walked onto this floor, and she had identified it in exactly two people, Britta and the second-year resident Okonkwo, who had appeared in the corridor outside room 14 and was now helping manage two other patients who'd been destabilized by the alarm and the power interruption. Dr. Vale was nowhere visible. He was presumably still managing the construction trauma case on the other side of the horseshoe, which was, objectively, where he should be. The fact that Alexandra noted his absence was not about him. It was about knowing who was where. They moved Briggs in 11 minutes. It was not graceful. He hissed through his teeth twice when the transport chair hit a threshold in the flooring and jarred his abdomen, and Harmon almost walked into a crash cart that had been left in the wrong position by someone during the initial alarm response. But they got him to the service elevator, down to the second floor, and into a windowless procedure prep room that had 2 entry points and no exterior access. Briggs gripped her arm as she helped transfer him from the chair to the prep table. You served, he said. Not a question this time either. Something in the way she'd moved, the way she'd done the threat assessment of the room, the way she carried information without performing it. We should focus on your IV lines, she said. One of them had pulled slightly during the move and needed resecuring. I'm not asking for small talk. She worked the IV line. Yes, she said. I served. What unit? She taped the line. The kind that isn't on any paperwork you've seen. He was quiet for a moment. Then, Is this connected to the contracts? She looked up at him. The procurement fraud, he said. I've been sitting in that room for 3 days wondering if anyone was going to try to finish what they started. The surgery wasn't supposed to be a recovery. Someone cut the wrong thing and called it a complication. Alexandra set down the tape. Who knows you believe that? My lawyer, my adjutant, and apparently whoever put that thing in the stairwell. Don't say that to anyone else in this building right now. Who should I say it to? She straightened. Give me some time. He looked at her for a long moment. How much time do you need? Less than you think. The security office on the second floor of Mercy Crest was a glass-walled room that looked out over the main lobby, staffed overnight by a rotating team of 4. When Alexandra walked in, there were 6 people crammed into the space. The overnight security supervisor, 2 officers who'd responded from other posts, Harmon, the second plainclothes officer whose name she'd learned was Dressler, and a man in his late 40s in a dark gray suit who had appeared from somewhere and had the indefinable quality of someone who was used to being the most important person in a room. He introduced himself as Deputy Director Kelman, Federal Protective Services, and he was looking at Alexandra like she was a variable he hadn't accounted for. Ms. Carter, he said, walk me through what you saw. She did. Concisely, linearly, without editorializing. The dispensary log discrepancy, the badge number, the timing, the stairwell, the device placement, the exit through the fire door. She had a good memory, not a performance of it, just the genuine article, the kind that gets trained into a person when the cost of forgetting details is measured in lives rather than grades. When she finished, Kelman was quiet for a moment. Then he said, You identified a potential threat device, followed the suspect unilaterally, and did not immediately notify security or law enforcement. I notified my contact. Who is your contact? Someone who will make themselves known when it's appropriate. Kelman's jaw tightened. Ms. Carter, I need you to understand that you are a hospital employee, and this is a federal protective matter. The device is still on the stairwell railing, she said. Coburn is somewhere in this building or in the immediate vicinity. There is a man on the second floor who someone tried to kill in the OR and is apparently trying to kill again, and right now your most useful conversation is not with me. The security supervisor, a compact man named Ferris, who had been watching this exchange with visible discomfort, cleared his throat. She's right about the device. We've locked down the north stairwell, but we haven't cleared it yet. We're waiting on... Clear it, Kelman said. Yes, sir. The room reorganized itself around the immediate practical problem, and Alexandra stepped back to let it. She positioned herself near the door, which was partly practical. She could move faster from there, and partly because she wanted to be on the edge of the information flow rather than inside it, where she could observe what Kelman's team knew and what they were choosing to share. They knew more than they were saying. She could see it in the way Kelman handled the radio updates from his own people, the slight pauses before he responded, the careful word choices, the moments where he redirected questions rather than answering them. He hadn't been surprised enough when she described the device. He'd been surprised that she could describe it, which was a different thing. She sent another text to the unnamed contact. This time she typed, Federal presence on site. Kelman. Do you know him? The response came back in 40 seconds. Yes. Not the problem. But watch what he doesn't tell you. She put the phone away. Dr. Marcus Vale found her in the corridor outside the security office at 11:40. He had come down from the trauma floor once the construction worker had been stabilized and transferred to the ICU, and someone had told him about the incident on the east corridor, the device, the suspect, the patient move. And he had arrived on the second floor wearing the expression of a man whose domain had been disrupted without his knowledge or authorization, which he experienced as a personal offense. Carter. He said her name like a correction. What exactly have you been doing for the last 90 minutes? Managing a patient security situation. You're a floor nurse on a 4-hour shift. You don't manage security situations. You call security and stay with your patients. My patients were covered. Okonkwo handled the floor. That's not... He stopped. Recalibrated. You followed an unauthorized person into a stairwell. Yes. Alone. It was a time-sensitive decision. He looked at her the way he'd looked at her at the medication dispensary, like he was searching her face for the gap between what she was saying and what she actually was, and coming up frustrated. I don't know where you came from or what kind of operation you ran at your last facility, But here, nurses do not make unilateral calls in active security situations. That's not protocol. That's not safe. And frankly, it's not your job. She waited until he was done. Is there a patient who needs me right now, Dr. Vale? That's not the... Because if there is, I should go. And if there isn't, this conversation can wait. He stared at her. The particular helplessness of a man who is used to verbal dominance, encountering someone who genuinely doesn't need it to resolve in his favor, was visible on his face in a way that he probably didn't know it was visible. He pointed at her. When this situation is resolved, I want to talk to you about your fit on this floor. Of course, she said. He walked away. She watched him go, and for a second, just a second, something crossed her face that was not professional neutrality. It was old and tired and specific, the feeling of being told by someone who has never been anywhere truly dangerous that you don't understand how dangerous things work. She had felt it before. She would feel it again. It passed, the way it always did, and she turned back to the corridor. That was when she saw the woman. Juan. She was standing near the main lobby entrance, on the civilian side of the second-floor divide, in a coat that was too dry for the weather outside and a visitor's badge that had been issued. Alexandra clocked this from 30 feet, in the last 20 minutes. She was 60, perhaps, with close-cropped silver hair and the erect posture of someone who had worn a uniform for most of their adult life, and retained the spine of it long after the uniform itself was gone. She was looking at the security office with an expression that was not curiosity. It was assessment. Alexandra walked toward her. The woman saw her coming and didn't move, which was itself informative. Someone who had come here for an innocent reason and saw a nurse walking purposefully toward them in the middle of an active security situation would step back or look uncertain or ask what was happening. This woman stood her ground and waited, which meant she knew what was happening or knew enough of it to not be surprised by any of it. They met in the open space between the elevator bank and the lobby. Lieutenant Carter, the woman said, quietly enough that it didn't carry. The title moved through Alexandra like cold water. She had not been called that in a very long time. You're the contact, Alexandra said. I'm one of several. I'm the one who was in the building when you sent the second text. The woman's eyes moved to the security office and back. Kelman's clean, but one of the people he brought with him isn't. We don't have confirmation yet, but we're working on it. Which one? That's what I need you to help us determine. Alexandra looked at the woman carefully. What's your authority here? Officially? None. I'm a retired defense analyst visiting a patient. A slight pause. Unofficially, I've been running the parallel investigation into the same procurement network that Briggs uncovered. We've been ahead of the exposure attempt since last week. We knew something was planned for this facility. We didn't know the internal mechanism until tonight. Coburn. Coburn is small. He's contracted. He doesn't know the full picture. We're confident on that. He placed a device. Yes, a disruption mechanism, not a detonator. It would have triggered a localized power failure in the East Corridor, disabled the monitoring equipment in room 14 for approximately 4 minutes, and created a window. The woman's voice was even, clinical. 4 minutes is enough. Alexandra absorbed this. So tonight wasn't the attempt. It was the prep. The attempt is scheduled for day after tomorrow. A procedure. It's on the books as a routine post-surgical scope. It was added to the record 3 days ago by someone with physician-level system access. The woman's eyes held hers. We don't know who has that access. That's why you're here. The elevator bank behind them dinged. Both women turned slightly, reflexive, automatic, and watched the doors open. A janitor with a mop cart. Nothing. Kelman's team, Alexandra said. How many did he bring? 4. 2 you've seen, 2 you haven't. I need access to the staff access logs for the last 72 hours, physician level and above. We're pulling them now. And I need someone watching Briggs's room who isn't part of Kelman's team and isn't hospital security. Already there. A small dry pause. You're not as alone in this as you've been operating. Alexandra looked at her. I've been operating alone because that was the instruction. The instruction changed when Coburn placed the device. The timeline moved. The woman pulled a card from her coat pocket, plain white, a phone number, nothing else, and held it out. Use this if you need a direct line. Not texts, voice only. Alexandra took the card. What do I call you? Marsh, the woman said. That's sufficient. And then Marsh turned and walked toward the elevator, pressed the button, and stood waiting with the patience of someone who had learned patience the same way Alexandra had, the hard way, in places that required it. And the elevator came, and she stepped inside, and the doors closed, and Alexandra was standing alone in the space between the elevator bank and the lobby, with a plain white card in her hand, and the alarm that had long since been silenced still echoing somewhere in the back of her mind. She stood there for approximately 4 seconds. Then she went back to work. The north stairwell device was assessed and removed by 1:15 in the morning by a technical team that Kelman had apparently had on standby. Another data point that told her the federal presence here was not improvised. The device was confirmed as a disruptive EM pulse emitter, non-explosive, designed to knock out electronic systems within a 20-foot radius for a defined interval. Sophisticated enough to require real sourcing, not something you ordered online. Someone with genuine procurement access had put this together, which meant this wasn't Coburn's operation. Coburn was, as Marsh had said, small. Seth Coburn was found at 2:08 a.m. hiding in a supply closet on the 3rd floor, which told its own story. If he'd had a proper exit plan, he would have been long gone. He was frightened, and he was not, under that fear, particularly sophisticated. Hospital security and 2 of Kelman's officers took him into custody without incident. Alexandra was not in the room when they questioned him. She was on the 4th floor, back on the trauma floor, finishing the last 2 hours of her shift, because the floor still had patients, and the patients still needed nurses, and she was still, functionally, the nurse assigned to bays 2 through 4. Britta Solano, who had returned to the trauma floor after ensuring Briggs was settled and secured on the 2nd floor, watched Alexandra move through the last hours of the shift with an expression that had shifted, somewhere around midnight, from practical assessment to something more complicated. Britta was a woman who had processed a great deal of information over 25 years of nursing, and she was processing information now. At 2:30, during a quiet interval, she appeared at Alexandra's shoulder. "You know how to move a trauma patient in a power failure," Britta said. "It's a basic nursing skill. The way you cleared that room wasn't basic nursing." A pause. "I've worked with military medical staff before. Contract personnel, post-deployment transfers. You move like them." Alexandra looked at the chart in front of her. "I appreciate the team tonight. Everyone handled it well." Britta was quiet for a moment. "You don't have to tell me anything," she said. "But I want you to know that whatever you're doing here, you can ask me for help. I've been on this floor for 16 years. I know where things are." Alexandra looked up at her. Britta's face was entirely straightforward. No agenda, no performance. Just the direct offer of someone who had identified a genuine need and had the resources to address it. "The access logs for physician-level system entries," Alexandra said. "Can you pull those without routing it through administration?" Britta thought for 1 second. "Floor supervisor can request a system audit log directly from IT. Administrative notification comes after the fact. Can you do that now?" "I can do that at 3 a.m. when it overnight is half asleep and processes requests on autopilot." Britta straightened. "Give me 20 minutes." She walked away before Alexandra could say anything else. 23 minutes later, Britta came back with a printed log sheet and set it on the counter beside Alexandra's chart without comment, then walked to the other end of the nurse's station and resumed her work. Alexandra looked at the log. Physician-level system entries for the past 72 hours. There were 47 entries. Most of them were routine, chart updates, prescription modifications, surgical scheduling changes. She scanned them with the methodical speed of someone who knew what they were looking for, even if they didn't yet know what it looked like. She found it on the 3rd pass. A scheduling entry logged at 11:47 p.m. 2 days ago. A post-surgical scope procedure added to Warren Briggs's care plan. Physician-level access. The logged user ID was for an attending hospitalist named Dr. Pauline Reese. Alexandra looked up the staff directory. Dr. Pauline Reese. Attending hospitalist. Mercy Crest Medical Center. 8 years on staff. Photo on the directory. 50s, silver-streaked hair pulled back, unremarkable. She pulled up the sign-in records for the night the entry was made. Dr. Pauline Reese had not been in the building. Her keycard had not been used. Her parking access had not been logged. The after-hours sign-in sheet, which was paper-based and existed as a redundant check, had no entry for her name. Someone had used her credentials remotely, which meant someone had her log in, which meant either she had given it to them or they had taken it. through a phishing access, through a direct system compromise, or through the more uncomfortable possibility that Reese herself was involved and had arranged a plausible deniability alibi by ensuring she wasn't physically on site when the entry was made. Alexandra set the log sheet down. She picked up the plain white card Marsh had given her and went to the staff bathroom at the end of the corridor, ran the water in the sink, and called the number. Marsh picked up on the second ring. "Reese," Alexandra said. "Dr. Pauline Reese. Her credentials were used to add the scope procedure. She wasn't in the building." A pause on the other end. "We'll run her. There's a faster way. She's on staff. If her credentials were compromised remotely, IT can trace the access origin. If she gave them willingly, there's a different trail." "What kind?" "Anyone with the access to add a procedure to a protected patient's care plan without triggering an administrative review had to know that the patient was protected. That information is not in the standard medical record. It's in the security coordination brief, which was distributed to—" She paused, running it. "Hospital administration, lead trauma staff, and the federal protection team." Silence on Marsh's end for several seconds. "You're saying whoever did this had access to the security brief," Marsh said. "I'm saying whoever did this knew Briggs was under protection, knew what level, and knew that a routine-appearing care plan modification was the cleanest internal vector." She looked at herself in the bathroom mirror. "That's not a phishing attack on a hospitalist's email. That's someone who was in the room." Another silence. Then Marsh said, "Give me 40 minutes. I have 35 until my shift ends. I'll be fast." The line went dead. Alexandra turned off the tap, looked at herself in the mirror for one moment, tired, clear-eyed, not yet done, and went back to the floor. She was documenting her last patient notes at 3:47 a.m. when Dr. Vale reappeared on the trauma floor. He had changed into fresh scrubs, which meant he'd gone home or to the on-call room and come back, and he was carrying a coffee and the particular energy of a man who had been thinking during a sleepless interval and arrived at conclusions he wasn't entirely comfortable with. He stood at the end of the nurse's station and looked at Alexandra for a moment before approaching. She didn't look up from the documentation. "I spoke to Kelman," he said. "Okay." "He wouldn't tell me much, but he told me enough." A pause. "The device in the stairwell, the patient relocation." He said the response was, he used the word appropriate. Vale said the word like it had surprised him when he heard it. Coming from a Federal Protective Services officer about a floor nurse's judgment call, that's— He was being generous, Alexandra said. The response had gaps. "Don't do that." She looked up. Vale's face was uncomfortable in a specific way. The discomfort of a man who is in the process of being wrong about something he said loudly and publicly and is not yet sure how to navigate it. "Don't undersell it to make this easier for me." She held his gaze. "I wasn't doing that for you." He absorbed that, set his coffee down. I was dismissive of you, earlier tonight, and before that." "You were." "I'm telling you I was wrong to be." "I heard you." She turned back to the documentation. "That patient in Bay 4 needs a reassessment note before handoff. The overnight resident marked it done, but I don't see the output." A beat. Then Vale picked up his coffee, walked to the terminal beside her, and pulled up Bay 4's chart. "I'll do it," he said. She didn't say anything. She kept documenting. He kept working beside her. It wasn't reconciliation. It wasn't clean. It was just two people in a hospital in the early hours of the morning doing what needed to be done, which was maybe the closest thing to an honest resolution that a night like this one allowed. At 4:03 a.m. her phone buzzed. Not a text. A call. Marsh's number. She stepped away from the station. "We have a name," Marsh said. Her voice was controlled, but something underneath it was not. "The access to the security brief. We traced it." "Who?" "It's not Reese. She was a dead end. Her credentials were spoofed through a compromised terminal in the hospital's administrative suite." A pause. "The terminal access traces to a meeting room on the administrative floor. Meeting room 3C. The booking record for 3C over the past 72 hours shows one entry. A scheduled coordination meeting, day before yesterday. Attendees logged by card access." Another pause, shorter. "One of the attendees was Kelman's team." Alexandra stood very still. "Which one?" she said. "The one you haven't seen yet," Marsh said. "He didn't come to the security office with the others. He's been operating separately, feeding information back. We think he's been the inside coordination for Coburn since before Briggs was admitted." A breath. His name is Ferris. He's in the building right now. We don't know where. Alexandra looked down the corridor. The amber emergency lighting had long since switched off, and the normal fluorescent overhead had come back. The floor looked ordinary. It looked like a hospital in the middle of the night. It looked like exactly the kind of environment where you could miss something if you stopped watching. Where's Briggs? She said. Second floor. Room. Is anyone with him right now? One of yours? A half-second pause that was a half-second too long. There should be, Marsh said. Hold on. Alexandra was already moving. She hit the stairwell door at the end of the corridor, the south stairwell, not the north, and took the stairs at a pace that was faster than running but quieter, the kind of movement that comes from knowing how to place your feet. And she came through the second floor door into the corridor and turned toward the procedure prep room where Briggs had been moved, and she could see from 30 feet that the corridor outside the room was empty. Harmon's post was empty. She moved faster. She was 15 feet from the door when she heard, from inside the room, the specific and unmistakable sound of a medical cart being moved. Not quickly, deliberately, with the careful, controlled movement of someone who did not want to be heard. She stopped outside the door, put her hand flat against it, pushed it open 1 inch, and looked through the gap. Warren Briggs was awake in the prep table. His eyes found the door, found the inch of visible space, found her. His face was entirely still. His hands, she could see, were gripping the rail on the side of the table, and the grip was the kind you use when you are preparing to move despite everything in your body telling you not to. Standing with his back to the door, at the IV stand beside the table, was a man she had not seen before. Medium height, the dark suit of a federal officer, working at something on the IV line with a precise, unhurried focus. The IV line that ran directly into Warren Briggs' arm. She had 3 seconds to make a decision. She made it in 1. She hit the door open with her shoulder and crossed the room in 4 strides, and got her hand around the IV line above his hand and clamped it closed before he could complete what he was doing. And the man, Ferris, spun around with something in his free hand, a small capped syringe, and his face was the face of someone who had been caught past the point of cover stories and was now operating on a different calculus entirely. Step back, she said. He looked at her hand on the IV line. He looked at her face. He looked at the door. You're a nurse, he said, like this was either a problem or a joke, and he hadn't decided which. Step back from the line, she said. Put the syringe on the cart. Do it now. He didn't move. Behind her from the doorway, Briggs said, in a voice that was pain-rough but entirely certain, she told you to step back. Ferris looked at both of them. At the syringe in his hand. At the door, which was now behind Alexandra, which meant she was between him and the exit, which meant the geometry of the room had just arranged itself very badly for him. His hand shifted slightly on the syringe, and Alexandra, who had learned in places that did not appear on any paperwork what it looks like when a person decides they have nothing to lose, was already moving when his arm came up. She caught his wrist before the syringe completed its arc. Not cleanly. I was fast. Faster than she'd expected from someone in a suit who'd spent the last 3 days playing federal escort. And the angle was wrong, and she had to twist her grip twice before she got control of it. And in the process, the back of her elbow hit the IV stand, and the whole thing swayed, and the secondary line pulled taut against Briggs' arm, and he made a sound through his teeth that she registered and filed and did not have time to address. Ferris was strong. He was also, she realized in the first 2 seconds of the struggle, trained. Not combat trained exactly, but security trained. The defensive grappling that gets drilled into protective service officers until it becomes instinct. And his instinct right now was to break the wrist grip and create distance and get to the door. She didn't let him create distance. That was the difference between security training and what she had. Security training taught you to disengage and reassess. What she'd learned had no interest in reassessment. She drove forward, used his own backward momentum against him, and put him into the wall beside the supply cabinet with enough force that the cabinet rattled and 2 sealed saline bags fell off the top shelf and hit the floor. The syringe skittered across the tile. Ferris hit the wall shoulder first and grunted and immediately started to push back off it, and she let him push because she was already stepping to the side. And when he came off the wall, she used his forward motion to redirect him into the prep table rail, which caught him across the hip with a sound that was not pleasant. He went down on 1 knee. She put her knee on his back, got his arm behind him, and held it there. The room was loud with breathing, hers, his. From the prep table, Briggs, controlled but effortful, the breathing of someone managing serious pain while refusing to show how much of it there was. "Don't," she said to Ferris. "Just that." He stopped trying to move. For approximately 4 seconds, none of them spoke. Then Briggs said, "The syringe. I see it. Don't let him near it." "I know." She reached into the front pocket of her scrubs with her free hand and pulled out the pen light she carried on every shift. A small thing, metal, heavier than it looked. And she set it on the floor 2 feet from the syringe so she could track both from her peripheral vision. Then she pulled her phone, dialed Marsh's number with one thumb, and said when it connected, "Room on the second floor, now, bring everyone." Marsh said something she didn't catch because Ferris chose that moment to test the arm hold, and she increased the pressure by about 20%, which communicated everything he needed to know about that option, and he stopped. It took 4 minutes for the corridor to fill. It felt longer. When the door finally opened, Marsh first, then 2 men she hadn't seen before. Then Harmon, appearing from somewhere with the expression of a man who was reassembling the night's events in real time and was not enjoying the picture. Alexandra released the hold and stood up and stepped back from Ferris, and the 2 men had him secured within seconds with the efficient, unhurried competence of people who'd done it before. She crossed to the syringe without touching it, crouched down and looked at it. The cap was still on. He hadn't gotten that far. "Potassium?" she said to no one in particular. Marsh crouched beside her. "Most likely. Stops the heart. Looks like cardiac arrest in a post-surgical patient. Would have been attributed to a complication from the original surgery." A pause. "Clean. Defensible. If you hadn't been in the building." "If I hadn't been in the building, this floor would have been dark for 4 minutes, 2 days from now, and nobody would have questioned the scope." "Yes." She stood up. Her left shoulder ached where she'd hit the IV stand. It would be a bruise by morning, nothing structural. And her right hand was shaking very slightly, which was adrenaline and not fear, and she knew the difference. She pressed her palm flat against her thigh until it stopped. Ferris was on his feet now, controlled, saying nothing. His face had closed entirely. The particular blank of someone who has already decided they're not talking and is waiting out the next several hours in that decision. She looked at him for a moment. "Who sent you?" she said. "Nothing." "He won't answer that here," Marsh said quietly. "I know." She looked at him for another second, not because she expected him to respond, but because she wanted him to understand that she was not finished. Then she turned away. Briggs was sitting up on the prep table. Someone had righted the IV stand and the line was running normally again, but he'd pulled his arm across his abdomen in the protective way of someone whose surgical site had just been jostled, and the color in his face was not good. He needed a proper assessment, a vitals check, possibly a scan to confirm the repair hadn't shifted. She went to him before anyone else did. "Let me see the site," she said. He moved his arm. She examined the dressing. Intact, no visible bleeding through the gauze, and then checked his pulse at the wrist. Fast. Not catastrophically so, but elevated beyond where a resting post-surgical patient should be, which was the combination of pain and adrenaline and the specific toll that lying in a hospital bed. Knowing someone is trying to kill you takes on a person's body regardless of how much military training they have. "Pain level," she said. "Manageable." "That's not a number." He looked at her. 6. "Did the line pull hard when the stand went?" "Yes." "I'm going to need to get you upstairs for an ultrasound." "I need 5 minutes first." She straightened, looked at him. He wasn't asking permission exactly. He was a decorated military officer and he was not accustomed to asking anyone permission for anything. But there was something in the way he said it that acknowledged she was the authority in this specific context, which was the closest thing to deference she suspected he offered. 5 minutes, she said. He nodded. Then he looked past her at Marsh. "Tell me it's enough," he said. Marsh glanced at the 2 men with Ferris, and something passed between her and Briggs that was older than tonight. The coded language of people who had been in the same operational circles long enough to communicate in shorthand. "The syringe plus the device plus Coburn plus Ferris," Marsh said. "The chain is clear enough. We can move on the source." "You're sure?" "Sure enough." Briggs closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, his face had changed slightly. The sustained tension of a man who had been bracing for something releasing by 1 degree. Just 1. There was too much still unresolved for more than that. "Then move," he said. The next 2 hours rewrote the architecture of the night. Marsh's people were more numerous than Alexandra had understood. They came from different directions. A woman who had been posing as a cleaning staff supervisor on the overnight rotation, two men who had been in a vehicle in the hospital parking structure for the past 6 hours, a fourth who had apparently been in the building's IT room since 10 p.m. running a parallel trace on the system access. They converged on the administrative floor with a coordination that was quiet and fast and entirely invisible to the hospital staff going about the normal business of a 5 a.m. shift change. Alexandra was not part of that convergence. Her job, in the hours that followed, was Warren Briggs. She got him upstairs to radiology for the ultrasound. The on-call tech was a young man named Parrish who was understandably disoriented by the arrival of a post-surgical patient under armed escort at 4:30 in the morning and handled it by focusing entirely on the technical task, which was the correct response. The scan showed the repair was intact. The jostling from the IV stand had not compromised the suture line. He was in pain and he was exhausted and he had nearly been killed twice in 4 days, but he was structurally sound. She relayed this to Harmon, who relayed it to Kelman, who had spent the last 2 hours in a state of controlled fury about the fact that one of his own team members had been the inside threat. That kind of betrayal reorganized everything: the protection detail, the information chain, the basic operational trust, and the reorganization was not pretty. Kelman was professional enough not to let it show in front of hospital personnel, but she could read it in the set of his shoulders when she passed him in the corridor, the way a person carries something that has been broken and is still figuring out where all the pieces went. She didn't say anything to him. It wasn't her conversation to have. At 6:15 a.m., as the day shift began arriving and the hospital resumed its normal rhythm around the broken architecture of what had happened overnight, Marsh found her in the staff corridor outside radiology. "We have Coburn talking," Marsh said. "What's he giving you?" "Enough. The procurement fraud network Briggs uncovered. It goes further than a set of falsified contracts. It connects to a series of defense acquisitions over the past 8 years, involving inflated invoicing, shell companies, and the deliberate suppression of internal audits." She paused. "Soldiers in 2 separate operations were sent into under-resourced situations because the money allocated for their equipment and support was being redirected. Some of them didn't come back." Alexandra was quiet. "Coburn knew pieces of it," Marsh continued. "Ferris knew more. The person above both of them—" She stopped, looked at Alexandra with something careful in her expression. "The source is a man named Gerald Price, Deputy Undersecretary, Defense Acquisition Division. He's been running this network for 11 years. The name landed without visible reaction. But something in Alexandra's chest tightened with a familiar, old wound kind of pressure that had nothing to do with tonight specifically, and everything to do with the shape of what Marsh had just described: the timeline, the operations, the redirected resources, the soldiers who hadn't come back. "Price," she said. "You know the name." "I know the type." A pause. "What's his exposure?" "Direct communication with Ferris over an encrypted channel. Financial records connecting his office to the shell companies. Coburn's testimony on the instruction chain." Marsh's voice stayed even. "It's enough. Our team filed the federal request 20 minutes ago. He's being picked up this morning." Alexandra leaned against the corridor wall. Not because she was tired, though she was, in a way that went below the physical, but because the specific weight of 11 years of something being broken and the possibility of it being named was the kind of thing that required a moment to stand still with. "The operations," she said. "The soldiers. Will be part of the congressional review. Their records—" "Some of their families don't know why they didn't come back," Alexandra said. "Not really. They were told operational complications, fog of war, the language that means nothing and explains nothing and leaves people sitting with a story that has no ending." Marsh looked at her. "I know. Will the review actually reach them?" "I can't promise you that." "I'm not asking for a promise. I'm asking if you think it will." A pause. Honest pause. Not a stalling one. "I think the case is strong enough that it's difficult to suppress the full scope of it. I think the people who have been carrying incomplete information for years will get more of it, whether that constitutes an ending for any of them." She stopped. "I don't know." Alexandra nodded. It was the right answer. The honest answer was always better than the reassuring one, even when it was harder to receive. "The procedure on Briggs's care plan," she said. "The scope that was added. It needs to be removed from his record and flagged as a fraudulent entry before the day shift physicians review his chart. Your IT contact, Britta, can do it through the floor supervisor audit process. It will create a formal record of the unauthorized modification. She straightened off the wall. It needs to be done in the next 40 minutes before rounds. Go, Marsh said. No. She found Britta at the fourth floor nurses' station, 40 minutes into the day shift, managing a handoff briefing with the composure of someone who had processed the night's events and organized them into actionable information and was now functioning in the gap between what had happened and what needed to happen next, which was where Britta Solano apparently lived most of the time. Alexandra explained what she needed in 3 sentences. Britta opened the system on the terminal, ran the supervisor audit flag, identified the fraudulent procedure entry, and submitted the formal modification request to IT with the unauthorized access notation attached. The whole process took 7 minutes. She did it without asking Alexandra to explain further, without requiring context she didn't need, and without making it mean more than it was. When she was done, she turned from the terminal and looked at Alexandra with an expression that had several layers to it and was not sorting itself into words. "You're not transferring back from Kansas," Britta said. "I work here," Alexandra said. "On this floor." "That's not what I said." A pause. "I know." Britta held her gaze for a moment. "The board is going to have questions about last night. The device, the patient move, all of it. Your name is on the incident reports." "I know." "You'll need to have a version of events that the hospital administration can work with." "I'll have one." She paused. "Britta, the way you moved last night, you didn't hesitate. Patients needed to be safe." "Yes, but a lot of people in your position would have waited for authorization first." Britta looked at her. "In 25 years, I've learned that authorization after the fact is almost always easier to get than it is before, especially when you're right." A pause. "You were right. Most of the time, that's not enough." "No," Britta agreed. "It isn't." She turned back to the station. "The day charge is here. You've been on since 6 p.m. Go home." Alexandra picked up her bag from the locker room. Her military duffel, worn at the straps, heavy with the things she'd brought without knowing exactly what the next 36 hours would require. She walked through the trauma floor, past the bays, past the horseshoe curve of the nurses' station, past Bay 2 where she'd worked the elderly stroke patient in the middle of everything else, and into the elevator. In the elevator, she leaned against the back wall and let herself be still for a moment. Her left shoulder ached, her eyes were burning from the sleeplessness. There was a coffee stain on her scrub top that she didn't remember getting. She felt the specific kind of emptied out that follows sustained adrenaline over an extended period. Not exhaustion exactly, but the aftermath of having been fully operational for many hours and now not needing to be, which was its own kind of difficult. The elevator opened on the lobby level. She walked through. Dr. Marcus Vale was in the lobby. She wasn't sure why. Perhaps he'd come down for coffee, or perhaps he'd simply ended up there the way people end up in hospital lobbies at the end of difficult nights, needing a different ceiling for a few minutes. He saw her crossing toward the exit, and something crossed his face that was not the careful performance of professional neutrality. It was genuine uncertainty. He said her name. She stopped. "I made some calls this morning," he said. "About you. About your transfer file." She waited. "The file is... there isn't much in it. Regional facility, 4 years, clean record. But the facility itself..." He stopped. Adjusted. "When I called the administrative contact, I got a routing message. It redirected to a federal intake line." He looked at her. "That's not how regional hospital administration works." "No," she agreed. "It isn't." "Who are you?" he said. Not unkindly. The way you ask when you've been genuinely wrong about something and you're trying to understand the actual shape of what was in front of you the whole time. She looked at him. She thought about what to give him, because some version of the truth was owed and some version needed to stay sealed. And finding the line between those two things in a hospital lobby at 6:30 in the morning was a judgment call she was making on approximately 4 hours of sleep spread across 2 days. "I'm a nurse," she said. "Everything on that floor last night, the IV checks, the patient assessments, the charting, that was real work and I did it. That part isn't a cover." "And the rest of it?" "The rest of it is above my pay grade to explain." She held his gaze. "You were right that trauma here is different from regional. You were wrong about why that mattered." He absorbed this. He was not a stupid man. She had always understood that. And she could see him putting pieces together in real time and arriving at an understanding that was incomplete but directionally correct. He looked, in this moment, less like the imperious chief surgeon of the past 10 hours, and more like a man who had been given accurate but incomplete information for a long time and is now recalibrating towards something closer to the truth. The patient, he said. Briggs. He's stable? The repair is intact. He needs rest and monitoring. He's safe. Because of you. She started to deflect it and then stopped herself. Yes. Vale nodded slowly. He looked like he wanted to say more and wasn't sure he had the words for it or the right to use them yet. She didn't fill the silence for him. Some things needed to be worked out on a person's own time. She picked up her duffel and walked toward the exit. The morning was gray and wet, the rain having slowed overnight to a steady drizzle that wasn't dramatic enough to feel meaningful, but was cold enough to make itself known. She stood under the ambulance bay overhang for a moment and breathed air that wasn't climate-controlled, that didn't smell of antiseptic and floor cleaner, that was just the cold, wet morning air of Graywood doing what mornings in November did. Her phone buzzed. A text from Marsh. Price in custody as of 6:42 a.m. Federal hold. More to follow. She read it twice. Then she put the phone in her bag and walked out into the rain. She was halfway to the parking structure when the second message came through. This one was not from Marsh. It was from the unnamed contact, the number she'd texted from the ambulance bay the night before, the one that had texted back her real name in that stairwell. She stopped walking. Read it. Read it again. The message was 11 words. Price wasn't the top. We found something. Come in now. She stood in the rain with the message on the screen and felt the particular cold clarity of understanding that the thing she had thought was an ending was not one, that what had been uncovered in the last 12 hours was a layer, and underneath that layer was another, and whoever was at the actual top of an 11-year network of defense fraud and suppressed operations and soldiers sent to die in under-resourced missions was not a man who was already in federal custody. She looked at the message for another 3 seconds. Then she turned around and walked back toward the hospital. Not toward the entrance, toward the parking structure where a dark blue sedan sat on the second level with its engine running, and in the driver's seat, visible through the rain-spotted windshield, was a face she recognized from a very long time ago. From a classified briefing in a building that did not officially exist, in the week before an operation that had never officially happened. And the face was not Marsh's, and it was not anyone she had seen tonight, and the fact that this person was here, in Graywood, outside Mercy Crest, at 6:50 in the morning, meant one of two things. Either they had come to bring her in and get ahead of what was below the next layer, or they had come because they were the next layer. She was 10 feet from the car when the driver's window came down. The face in the driver's window belonged to a man named Donovan Hale. She had last seen him 4 years ago in a windowless room in a building she was not allowed to name, sitting across a metal table with a folder of documents that would seal her service record and a pen. He sat down in front of her with the particular finality of someone closing a door they intend to never reopen. He had been mid-50s then. He was nearly 60 now, and the years had not been gentle. Deeper lines around the mouth, gray where there had been gray-brown. A heaviness in the way he held his shoulders that suggested something chronic rather than situational. But the eyes were the same. Pale, precise, the eyes of a man who processed information the way certain machinery processes material, continuously, without sentiment, without rest. She stood in the rain 10 feet from the car and did not move toward it. Hale looked at her through the open window. He did not wave her in. He did not speak first. He let the silence do what silences between people with operational history do. Compress the intervening years into a single moment. Make it clear that whatever had happened between the last meeting and this one was context but not excuse. You sent the text, she said. I sent the text. From the contact number. The number routes through a relay. I've had access to it for 2 years. He said it without apology. Get in, Alexandra. She looked at the car, looked at him, ran the calculation that she had been running since she read the 11 words on her phone. The calculation that sorted people into categories not by what they said, but by what they chose to do when they had options, and what Hale had chosen to do in the past was a data set she carried. He had sealed her record. He had also, 3 months before that, pulled her out of a situation that should have killed her when every operational protocol said to leave her behind. She had never been sure which of those facts was the true one, the protection or the erasure. And standing in a parking structure in the rain at 6:50 in the morning was not the time to resolve it. She got in the car. He drove without preamble, pulling out of the structure and into the gray morning streets of Graywood. She watched the hospital recede in the side mirror and said nothing, and waited. "Price is real," Hale said. "The arrest is real. The charges will hold." He paused. "But Price has been running the financial architecture for someone else. He's the mechanism, not the engine." "Who's above him?" "A woman named Sylvia Rowan." He let it sit for a moment. "Deputy National Security Advisor. 11 years ago, she authored the framework that enabled the acquisition fund restructuring that Price exploited. She knew it was exploitable because she designed it that way. The shell companies, the audit suppression, the operational resource diversions, she's been the oversight for all of it from the beginning. The name was new to her. The position was not. Deputy National Security Advisor was not a role that appeared on evening news broadcasts. It was the kind of position that operated in the space between public accountability and classified authority, doing the actual work of decisions that got attributed upward to more visible names. "What's her exposure?" Alexandra said. "As of this morning? Significant, but not yet sufficient. Price's financial records connect to the Shell network. The Shell network connects, through two intermediary layers, to accounts that Rowan controls through a trust structure her attorneys built over a decade." He navigated a turn. "The trust structure is technically legal. The money moving through it isn't, but proving the intent, proving she knew, that she directed it, requires one more piece." "What piece?" "Briggs." She looked at him. "He didn't just uncover the procurement fraud," Hale said. "Before he was admitted to Mercy Crest, before the surgery that was supposed to kill him, he had a meeting with a defense oversight investigator named Laura Taft. In that meeting, he provided documents. Not copies, originals. Physical documents from an internal audit that was suppressed in 2016. The audit named Rowan directly." A pause. "Taft was killed 6 days ago in what was reported as a vehicle accident outside of Arlington. The rain on the windshield, the wiper on its interval setting, the gray morning moving past the windows." "The documents," Alexandra said. "Briggs kept a copy, digitally encrypted, on a device he has not disclosed to anyone in the official protection detail. Because he doesn't know who in the official detail to trust." "Correct." She looked out the window. "He told me he knew the surgery wasn't a complication. He's been aware of the full scope since before he was admitted. He came to Mercy Crest because he needed the surgery to survive, and because he calculated that a high-profile hospital in a metropolitan center was harder to control than a military medical facility where access could be managed." Hale glanced at her. "He asked for you specifically." She turned from the window. "What?" "When the protective service detail was being assembled, Briggs gave one instruction. He said if the operation required embedded medical personnel with a classified background, he wanted Lieutenant Alexandra Carter." A pause. "He knew your name from the 2019 extraction report. The mission that got sealed. You pulled 3 of his former subordinates out of that site." She was quiet for a moment. "He never said that." "He wouldn't. Not until he was certain of the situation. He's not a man who shows his hand before he needs to." "Neither am I." She looked at Hale. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because Rowan knows the documents exist. She knows Briggs has them. And she knows Price's arrest this morning means the financial chain is exposed." He stopped at a light. "She has approximately 6 hours before the federal investigators formally expand the scope of the inquiry to include her office. In those 6 hours, she will attempt to eliminate the document evidence and the person who holds it. Briggs is in a secure room in Mercy Crest with a protection detail that has already been compromised once," Hale said. "Ferris was Roan's insertion, not Price's. She had her own channel into Kelman's team that was separate from the procurement network. Which means Kelman's current security reorganization may have gaps he doesn't know about yet." The light changed. She reached for her phone and called Marsh. Marsh picked up on the first ring. "Rowan," Alexandra said. "Do you have her?" A pause that lasted 1 second too long. "How do you know that name?" "Do you have her?" "She's not currently. Her office says she's in a scheduled briefing at the Halverson building. We have people moving to confirm." "The documents Briggs has. He needs to produce them now, before she moves. We've asked him. He says he'll give them to one person. Alexandra looked at Hale. He was watching the road with the expression of someone who already knew how this sentence was going to end. Let me guess, she said. They were back at Mercy Crest in 11 minutes. Hale stayed in the car, not because she asked him to, but because he understood, without it being said, that walking a face like his into that hospital at this moment would create complications that were not worth the cost. He had that quality, the ability to recognize the shape of a situation and position himself accordingly, which was either wisdom or pragmatism, and was probably both. Alexandra went in through the ambulance bay the same way she'd come in the night before. The morning shift was in full operation now. Different energy than the overnight, faster, more populated, the particular busyness of a hospital coming fully awake. She moved through it the same way she always moved, without urgency in her pace and without hesitation in her direction, and nobody stopped her. The procedure prep room on the second floor had been upgraded since 4 a.m. Two of Marsh's people were in the corridor. Proper positioning this time, no gaps in the coverage, the reorganized detail that Kelman had assembled after Ferris had been removed from it. They recognized Alexandra and stepped aside. Briggs was sitting up in the bed. He looked like a man who had slept for perhaps 90 minutes and made the decision to be functional anyway. There were lines in his face that hadn't been there when she first saw him, or perhaps they had, and she hadn't looked closely enough. He had an untouched cup of something that might have been coffee on the rolling table beside him, and he was looking at the door when she came through it like he had been waiting for specifically this. They told me you left, he said. I came back. I heard. He studied her for a moment. Hale. He found me in the parking structure. He's been running a parallel operation for 14 months, independent of mine, independent of Marsh's. A pause. I didn't know the full scope of his involvement until this week. Did you know he'd be here? I suspected. Hale goes where the top layer is. He looked at his hands. Rowan. You knew. I've known since 2020. I've been building toward it since then. He said it without drama, which made it land harder. 6 years. 6 years of carrying that information through the appropriate channels that kept deflecting it, and the inappropriate channels that kept getting closed, and the personal costs that accrued across all of it. Taft was the first person I trusted with the full picture. She was killed a week after I gave her the originals. I know. The copy I have, digital, encrypted. He reached under the mattress of the prep table. The movement pulled at his abdomen, and he paused, breathed through it, and continued. He produced a small device, a drive, standard-looking, the kind that was not standard at all. 743 pages of suppressed audit documentation, financial records, internal communications. 3 of those communications are between Rowan and the firm that set up the trust structure. 2 of them explicitly reference the fund diversions. He set it on the rolling table. In Rowan's own words. Alexandra looked at the drive. Why me? Because you were in that field site in 2019, he said. You know what it looks like when soldiers are abandoned because somebody somewhere decided their lives were worth less than what was in an acquisition fund. You've lived with the shape of that. He paused. I needed someone who wouldn't hand this to the wrong person, someone who understands what's at stake beyond the legal case. She picked up the drive. There's a passphrase, he said. 13 characters. I'll give it to you when you're in front of the right people, not before. And who are the right people? Marsh. The federal prosecutor on the Price case. Her name is Delacroix. She's clean. I've checked her independently twice. And the chair of the Defense Oversight Subcommittee, Senator Ilana Voss. She's been trying to reopen the 2016 audit suppression for 3 years and kept getting stonewalled. A pause. Those 3 in a room together with what's on that drive and Rowan's 6-hour window closes. Can you get them here? Marsh can get Delacroix. Voss is... It's a harder call. She's in session. He looked at her. But she knows my name. She'll come out of session for this. I'll make the calls, Alexandra said. There's one more thing. He picked up the untouched cup, looked at it, set it back down. The 2019 operation, the extraction, the 3 men you pulled out of that site. He stopped. There was something in the way he stopped that told her this was not the tactical part of the conversation. This was the other kind. One of them was my son. She looked at him. He didn't tell me until 2 years later. He's a pause that had weight in it. He's alive. Because of what you did. He cleared his throat. I know what was in your record when you went into that mission and what was sealed afterward, and I know that the sealing cost you. I know what you gave up. She was quiet for a moment. The morning light through the small high window in the prep room was pale and thin. Somewhere in the corridor outside, she could hear the day shift doing what day shifts did, the ongoing ordinary machinery of a hospital that had no idea what was happening inside one of its second-floor rooms. Make the calls, she said. Marsh got Delacroix on the phone in 40 minutes. The federal prosecutor was in her office when she picked up, and she moved from skeptical to focused in the span of about 90 seconds once Marsh relayed what was available, which told Alexandra something useful about Delacroix's instincts. Senator Voss was harder. Voss Chief of Staff ran 4 layers of gatekeeping that consumed 22 minutes and 2 escalating calls from Marsh before Briggs got on the line directly and said the name Rowan and said the words 2016 audit and said them in a specific order that apparently communicated something to Voss herself, who came on the line 30 seconds later and said she would be there within the hour. During those 40-odd minutes, while Marsh managed the communications and Hale, who had come inside after all, quietly, through a service entrance that Marsh had cleared, coordinated with Kelman's reorganized detail, Alexandra sat in the chair beside Briggs's prep table, and neither of them said anything for a while. It wasn't an uncomfortable silence. It was the silence of people who have been in the same kind of rooms. Not this room, but the same category of room, the ones where the action is over and the reckoning hasn't started yet, and there is nothing to do but exist in the interval. Your record, Briggs said eventually, when this is done. There will be grounds to unseal parts of it. I know. Do you want that? She considered the question honestly. I want the soldiers from the 2019 operation to be recognized. Whether my name is attached to that publicly is a separate question. It doesn't have to be. No. She looked at the drive on the rolling table, but it might need to be, depending on what the review requires. Is that okay? She thought about the parking structure, about walking out of the ambulance bay into the rain. About the years of working under a sealed file in facilities that didn't ask too many questions, carrying a version of herself that was both entirely true and radically incomplete. I'll manage, she said. He almost smiled. It was a partial thing, rough around the edges, the smile of a man who has forgotten how to do it fully and is working with what he has. Yes, he said. You will. Delacroix arrived first. She was younger than Alexandra had expected. Mid-30s, compact, with the quick eyes of someone who processed written material at speed and had built a case strategy in her head during the drive over. She shook hands with Briggs, shook hands with Marsh, looked at Alexandra and said, You're Carter? Yes. Marsh briefed me on last night, the IV line intervention. She held Alexandra's gaze for a moment. Good instincts. Lucky timing. Don't do that, Delacroix said. Not unkindly. The same thing Vale had said, in a different register, for a different reason. Voss arrived 18 minutes later, still in the professional clothes she'd been wearing in session, with one aide she left in the corridor at Marsh's request, and an energy about her that was barely contained urgency. She had the political instincts of someone who had been waiting for a specific moment for 3 years and could feel it arriving. She took the drive from the rolling table, looked at Briggs, the passphrase. Briggs recited 13 characters, a string that had no obvious mnemonic, the kind of passphrase that lived in a person's memory because it mattered enough to hold on to. And Voss passed the drive and the characters to her aide, who had been called back in for this specific moment, with instructions that the aide left to carry out immediately. Then Voss looked around the room. At Marsh, who had run a parallel investigation for 14 months from a position of unofficial authority and no formal mandate. At Hale, who had been tracking the top layer of this network since before most people in the room knew there was a top layer. At Briggs, who had identified the full architecture of it at personal cost that was visible in the surgical dressing under his hospital gown and the lines around his eyes that were not all from this week. At Delacroix, who was already organizing what came next. And at Alexandra, standing near the wall in day-old scrubs with a coffee stain on the front, who had come into this building the previous evening as a woman. Nobody looked at twice. This is going to move fast, Voss said. When it does, it's going to move publicly. The name will be in the open. She paused. All of the names. The network, the operations, the suppressed audit, the people who were affected. She looked at Briggs. Your office was right about the scope. This is systemic. I know what it is, Briggs said. The public component. There will be a hearing. Witnesses. Voss met Alexandra's eyes. There may be an ask that's difficult. Senator? Alexandra's voice was even. I spent 4 years watching people who died in undersupported operations get treated as statistics. If being in a hearing room is what it takes to make them into something else, that's not a difficult ask. Voss held her gaze for a moment. Then she nodded once. All right. Delacroix's phone rang. She stepped to the corner of the room, listened, said 3 words, and hung up. The trust structure, she said, turning to the room. Our forensic team found the second layer. The accounts Rowan controls through it received 14 transfers over 8 years totaling. She paused. Just for a moment, the pause of someone who has worked on financial fraud cases long enough that numbers don't usually land on her, and this one had. $47 million, directly traceable to the diverted acquisition funds. The room was quiet. She's still in the Halverson building? Marsh said. Our people have eyes on the building. She hasn't exited. Delacroix looked at her phone. The arrest warrant was filed 11 minutes ago. They're moving now. Alexandra looked at the window, the thin, pale light. The rain that had finally, sometime in the last hour, stopped. It should have felt like a conclusion. She was not sure why it didn't quite, and then she identified the reason. The same reason that the interval between action and reckoning was always harder than the action itself. Because the action had clear parameters. You moved, you assessed, you responded. The reckoning required something different. The patience to watch consequences unfold at institutional speed, through legal processes that moved in days and weeks rather than seconds, through hearings and documents and public statements rather than stairwells and IV lines and decisions made in the dark. She was not built for the fast version of this. She was not sure she was built for the slow version either. Briggs, reading something in her face, said quietly, It doesn't end clean. It never does. I know. But it ends. Her phone buzzed. She looked at the screen. A text from a number she had never seen before. Not Marsh's relay, not Hale's, not the contact number. A new number, one she had no record of. 5 words. She's gone. She left early. Alexandra read it. Read it again. She crossed the room to Marsh in 3 steps. Your people at the Halverson building. When did they last confirm visual on Rowan? Marsh's expression shifted. She pulled out her radio. The answer came back in 8 seconds. 41 minutes ago. Rowan had been in the building 41 minutes ago. The arrest warrant had been filed 11 minutes ago, which meant there was a 30-minute window during which someone with access to a law enforcement communication channel had known the warrant was coming before it was executed and had made a phone call or sent a message or done something that had given Sylvia Rowan 30 minutes she should not have had. Marsh's face was controlled, but the control was working harder than it had been. Find her, Alexandra said. Marsh was already on the radio. Delacroix was on her phone. Hale, who had been standing near the door saying very little and observing everything in the way that Hale operated, looked at Alexandra and said, with a quietness that contained a specific kind of weight, She has a contact in the prosecutor's office. The room went still. We've suspected for 8 months, he said. We couldn't confirm without exposing the investigation. If she was tipped off through that channel, he stopped. Looked at Delacroix in a way that was not accusatory, but was direct. The filing went through your office. Delacroix looked at him. Something moved across her face that was not guilt. It was the specific horror of a person who has just understood that something they were part of, without knowing it, became the mechanism of a failure. My office has 7 attorneys, she said. If one of them, which one handled the warrant filing, Hale said. Delacroix's jaw tightened. She made the call. She got the answer in 40 seconds. She lowered the phone. The name she said was one Alexandra didn't recognize, but it didn't matter because the expression on Delacroix's face, the cold, controlled fury of a person who has just found the rot in her own walls, said everything about the size of what had just happened, and the fact that Sylvia Roan, with 41 minutes of head start, was somewhere in Greywood or outside it, and the woman who had architected 11 years of defense fraud and buried the soldiers who died because of it was not in custody. She was running, and the only thing that had been assembled in this prep room, the drive, the passphrase, the witnesses, the warrant, was about to be tested by the one variable that had not been accounted for. Briggs looked at Alexandra. "You need to go," he said. She was already at the door. She took the south stairwell. Not because it was faster, it wasn't, but because it was the route she knew, the one she had already cleared in her head. And when you are moving fast, the last thing you can afford is to navigate unfamiliar geometry. She hit the ground floor in 20 seconds and came through the lobby at a pace that was not quite running, but was everything short of it, and she was already on the phone with Hale before the ambulance bay doors finished opening. "She has a 41-minute lead," Alexandra said. "What does she have access to?" "Her own vehicle, a service sedan registered to a consulting firm. Driver's license, 3 known aliases with corresponding documents. We identified them 8 months ago and didn't move on them because moving on them would have shown our hand." A pause that carried its own weight. "A property in Dunmore County, 40 minutes east of Graywood, registered to a subsidiary of the trust structure. We didn't flag it as a flight resource because we didn't think she'd have warning." "She had warning." "Yes." "Is anyone moving on the property?" "I'm coordinating now. Kelman's people plus federal marshals. 12 minutes out." "I'm 6, she said. "Alexandra, send me the address." A pause. Then, "You're not armed." "Send me the address, Donovan." She heard him make a decision in the 2 seconds of silence that followed. Whatever calculation he ran, it came out in her favor. Maybe because she had earned it. Maybe because he understood that telling her to stand down was not a conversation that would resolve quickly. Maybe simply because she was already outside and moving and the arithmetic was clear. The address came through as a pin on her phone. She crossed the parking structure at a run, got into Hale's dark blue sedan. He had left the keys in the cup holder, which told her he had anticipated this, and pulled out of the structure into the gray morning streets of Graywood before the phone had finished loading the route. 40 minutes of highway east of Graywood, the landscape changed. The city's density gave way to the kind of space that existed between places. Stretches of wet farmland, tree lines, the occasional structure set back from the road far enough to suggest that whoever built it valued the distance. The rain had left everything dark and saturated, the road surface slick and reflective, the sky a low uniform gray that made the morning feel later than it was. Alexandra drove fast and clean. Not recklessly. She was not performing, she was moving, and there was a difference. And she kept the phone on the seat beside her with the route running and Hale's line open. He updated her at intervals. Marshals 8 minutes out. Kelman's people rerouting from a position south of the property. Aerial surveillance requested but not yet confirmed. The picture he painted was of resources converging but not yet there, of a window that was narrowing but not closed, of a woman with 41 minutes of lead time and the resources of a decade-long criminal network, making decisions that someone with her background and her stakes would make when the ground fell away. She would not run blind. That was the thing about people like Rowan. They were not reactive. They were architects. They had contingencies because they had spent years building in contingencies. And the first contingency of a person who has always controlled the information flow is to find a way to control it one more time. Alexandra thought about what that looked like. What it looked like was evidence destruction. The documents on the drive were out of reach. Voss Aid had those, and the forensic chain was already moving. But there were other documents, 11 years of correspondence, of financial management, of the communications between Rowan and the people she had directed and the people who had served her. Some of that would be digital, distributed, recoverable. But some of it would be physical. The kind of records that a person who had designed a network around deniability kept in physical form precisely because physical could be burned. The property in Dunmore County. She pressed the accelerator. She saw the smoke when she was 2 miles out, a thin column of it, pale gray against the darker gray of the sky, rising from somewhere behind the tree line that marked the eastern edge of the property. Not a fire. A controlled burn. Contained, deliberate. The kind that produced that specific color and volume of smoke when paper and files were being fed into a barrel or a fireplace with the systematic focus of someone who knew they had a limited time and a finite amount to destroy. She turned off the main road onto the gravel track that the pin indicated and killed the headlights. Not because it helped much in daylight, but because it was instinct, the instinct of not advertising your approach, and came through the tree line at 30 miles an hour and stopped the car 40 feet from a low plain farmhouse with a detached garage and a flagstone path that led around the east side of the building toward the source of the smoke. She was out of the car before the engine finished ticking. Around the east side of the house, past a bare-limbed oak that had shed its leaves in the last storm, was a stone-enclosed fire pit that had not been built for outdoor entertaining. It was functional, deep, wide, designed to contain a significant volume of burning material. A woman was standing over it with her back to the path, feeding documents from a cardboard box into the fire with the methodical urgency of someone who has accepted that she is out of time and is working with what remains of it. Sylvia Roane was 63 years old, and she looked, from the back, like someone's well-dressed grandmother at an incongruous outdoor task. Silver hair, good coat, sensible shoes that were getting mud on them from the wet ground. She did not hear Alexandra come around the corner because Alexandra had not made noise coming around the corner. She heard her when Alexandra said, "Stop." Roane turned. Her face was the thing Alexandra studied first, before anything else. Because faces in moments like this one told you more than posture or hands or position. Roane's face was not the face of a caught person. It was the face of a person who had already processed being caught and had moved past it into whatever came next. And what came next for a woman like this was the next calculation, the next lever, the next thing that could still be controlled. "You're Carter," Roane said. Her voice was steady. Not performance steady, the kind that cost something, genuinely steady, the composure of someone for whom crisis was not new territory. "Step back from the pit. There's nothing left in there that matters." She nodded at the fire. "The originals were the only copies of anything linking me to specific decisions. Everything else is circumstantial." "That's not your call to make." "Actually," Rowan tilted her head slightly, and the gesture was almost academic, the gesture of someone about to make a point in a seminar room rather than a muddy field in Dunmore County. "It is currently, until the marshals arrive, which I estimate to be—" She glanced at her watch. 7 minutes. In 7 minutes it becomes their call. Right now it's still mine. She turned back to the box and reached for another sheaf of documents. Alexandra crossed the distance between them in 4 steps and took the box. It was not elegant. Rowan pulled back, the documents caught between them, and 2 sheets tore and landed on the wet ground, and one corner of the box hit the stone rim of the fire pit before Alexandra got control of it and stepped back with it under her arm. Rowan looked at her hand. She had cut the side of her palm on the stone edge, not badly, a surface split, and then looked at Alexandra with something that was, for the first time, not composed. It was the specific anger of someone who has never, in 11 years of operating in the highest levels of decision-making power, had something taken directly out of their hands by someone they had not planned for. "You have no authority here," Rowan said. "I have the box," Alexandra said. The fire continued to burn. Whatever had already gone into it was gone, but the box in her arms was substantial. 3 inches of documents, varied papers, handwritten notes on some of them, printed correspondence on others. She held it and looked at Rowan across the fire pit, and did not close the distance between them again, because the ground was uneven and wet, and closing distance unnecessarily was a choice you made when you had to and not before. "What do you think happens now?" Rowan said. The composure was coming back, settling over her like something she had practiced putting on. "My attorneys have been building a defense for 2 years. The trust structure is legal. The payments are defensible. Whatever that drive contains, 743 pages, Alexandra said, including 2 emails where you explicitly reference the fund diversions by name and instruct price on the transfer sequence." Something flickered across Roan's face. "Gone in under a second." "And your own words about the 2016 audit," Alexandra continued, "the one that named you and that you had suppressed through 3 separate intervention points. Laura Taft had the originals. You had her killed. That is an extraordinary— She's been dead for 6 days." Alexandra looked at her. "She had a daughter, 15 years old, you understand that? A 15-year-old girl lost her mother because you needed a document chain to disappear." Rowan's jaw was tight. She said nothing. "And the soldiers," Alexandra said, "the operations that were under-resourced because the acquisition funds were being redirected. I want you to understand that I was in one of those field sites. I have pulled men out of positions they should never have been put in conditions that should never have existed, because the equipment and the support that was allocated for their safety ended up in your trust accounts. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. I want you to know that I know exactly what that looks like on the ground. Not in a document. In the field. On people's bodies. The fire crackled between them. In the distance, from the direction of the main road, she heard the first sound of vehicles on gravel. Rowan heard it too. Something moved through her then. Not a breaking exactly, but a settling, the particular gravity of a person for whom the game has run its course and who is deciding in real time what they want their last minutes of freedom to look like. She straightened, adjusted the collar of her coat, looked at Alexandra with an expression that was almost clinical in its steadiness. You know what the worst part is, Rowan said, and her voice, for the first time, had something in it that was not calculation. I believed it was necessary, all of it, the diversions, the suppression. I believed the projects those funds supported were more important than the accounting. People died. People die in every budget cycle. Every resource allocation decision at that level costs lives somewhere. The question is always which lives and for what return. She looked at the fire. I made those calculations for 20 years. Some of them were right, and some of them were murder dressed up as policy. Rowan looked back at her. Yes, she said quietly. Some of them were. The gravel crunch was close now. Doors opening. Voices. Alexandra held the box and stood in the mud and looked at a woman who had held enormous power for a very long time and had convinced herself, probably genuinely, that the exercise of that power was its own justification. It was not a new story. It was one of the oldest ones. The belief that the person making the calculation is the right person to make it, that the distance between themselves and the consequences is a feature rather than a corruption, that necessity and self-interest look similar enough in the dark that you can stop checking which one you're carrying. Sylvia Rowan had stopped checking. The marshals came around the corner of the house, and the moment ended. It took 4 hours. 4 hours of federal processing at the Dunmore County Field Office, a small building that was not designed for this volume of activity, and handled it with visible strain, during which Alexandra gave a statement that was thorough and factual and took 40 minutes to complete. During those 4 hours, Rowan's attorneys arrived and were largely unable to do what attorneys are brought in to do, because the box of documents that Alexandra had pulled from the fire pit contained, among other things, 11 pages of handwritten notes in Rowan's own hand that cross-referenced specific fund transfers with specific operational decisions in a way that no defense argument could reframe as coincidence. It was not the documents from the drive that broke the defense. Those were important. They were the architecture, the formal proof of the financial structure. But it was the handwritten notes that did the specific damage, because handwritten notes are the things people make for themselves. And the things people make for themselves contain the version of events that they actually believe rather than the version they intend to present. In those 11 pages, Sylvia Rowan had recorded the truth of what she had done with the unself-conscious clarity of someone who had never imagined that what she was writing would be read by anyone other than herself. Delacroix, who had driven out to Dunmore with 2 members of her team, read those pages in the field office conference room and said nothing for a long moment after she finished. Then she looked at Alexandra. You pulled this out of the fire, she said. Most of it was already gone. Most isn't all. Delacroix set the pages down. This is enough. The rest is enough. The case is complete. By midday, the arrest had been formally processed, and Rowan had been transferred to federal custody in Graywood. By 2 p.m., the story had broken, not through a leak, but through Senator Voss, who stood in a corridor of the Senate building and gave a statement to 2 reporters who had been covering the defense procurement investigation for months, and who received the outline of what had happened with the stunned, careful focus of journalists trying not to show how significant they understood the story to be. By 4 p.m., Sylvia Rowan's name was on every major news platform in the country. The story was not clean in the telling. It was not a simple arc of villain and victim. It was what it actually was, a decade plus of institutional failure, of systems that were supposed to catch exactly this kind of corruption and had been specifically manipulated not to, of individuals who had seen parts of the picture and been unable to connect them until now. The reporting reflected that complexity, at least initially, because the reporters who had been covering it understood that the complexity was the story. Gerald Price cooperated fully within 24 hours of Rowan's arrest, which was the fastest cooperation Delacroix had seen in a decade of federal prosecution, and which she attributed, in a call to Marsh, to the particular human talent for abandoning a sinking structure the moment someone else is visibly on it. He gave them additional communications, additional financial records, the names of 4 other individuals connected to the network who were picked up over the following 3 days. Seth Coburn, who had been frightened in that supply closet, and remained frightened, gave a statement that filled in the operational coordination between Price's financial network and Rowan's direction. He was not a sympathetic figure, but he was a useful one, and the law treated those categories as separate. Ferris said nothing. He would likely continue to say nothing. That was his right and his choice, and the case did not require his participation to hold. Why? Alexandra returned to Mercy Crest on the 3rd day, not to work a shift, to collect her things from the locker, and to complete the incident report paperwork that the hospital's administrative department had flagged as outstanding, which was the kind of bureaucratic reality that persisted alongside everything else because institutions did not pause their administrative requirements for events that fell outside their normal parameters. She had slept. Not enough, but more than she'd had in the previous 72 hours, in a hotel room that Marsh's people had arranged, and the sleep had been the deep, non-negotiable kind that the body demands after sustained operational stress, regardless of what the mind intends. She had woken up with the bruise on her shoulder fully established, dark, considerable, the accurate physical record of a night that had required her to use her body in ways that nursing scrubs were not designed for, and had stood in the shower for a long time doing nothing in particular. She felt, walking back through the ambulance bay doors of Mercy Crest, older than she had felt walking through them 3 days ago. Not worse. Just more worn, the way a tool feels after it has been used for the thing it was made for. That was not self-pity, it was just accurate. Britta Solano was at the nurse's station. She saw Alexandra come through the doors and said nothing for a moment, just looked at her with those 25 years of assessment running behind her eyes. "There's coffee," Britta said. "Thank you. I heard about the fire pit. Some of it was already gone." "Some isn't all." Britta handed her a cup. It was exactly what Alexandra needed, and Britta had known this without asking, which was the particular competence of people who paid attention to what was in front of them rather than what they expected to see. "Dr. Vale wants to talk to you." "I know. He's been in his office a lot the last 2 days, which for him is unusual. He's usually moving." Britta looked at her mug. "I think he's been thinking." "Good. Don't be too generous with him." Alexandra looked at her. Britta met the look with something dry and precise. "He gets to feel bad about how he treated you," Britta said. "That's fair. He doesn't automatically get to feel better about it just because he acknowledges it. Those are 2 different things, and he should sit with the first one for a while before you give him the second." Alexandra drank her coffee. "You've thought about this." "I've been the person in this building who got looked past for 16 years, Britta said. "I've thought about it extensively." It was the most personal thing Britta had said to her in 3 days of working together through a crisis, and she said it with the matter-of-fact directness of someone who had processed it thoroughly and was no longer raw about it, but was still, underneath the processing, entirely clear on what it had cost. Alexandra recognized that. The way something can be resolved and still true simultaneously. Thank you, Alexandra said, for the coffee, for the 16 years, for all of it that she didn't specify. Britta nodded and turned back to the station. Vale's office was on the 4th floor, past the trauma bays, a room with a window that looked out over the hospital's east parking lot, and a desk that was covered in the organized chaos of a man who worked in his space rather than managing it. He stood up when she came in, which was a small thing, and not a small thing. "Sit down," he said. Then, "If you want to." She sat. He sat across from her and looked at his desk for a moment, not avoiding her, just gathering himself, the gesture of a man who has rehearsed something and is now deciding whether the rehearsed version is the right one. "I looked up your file again," he said. "The official version. It still doesn't say much." "No. I know enough of what happened here to understand that the version of you I decided on when you walked through those doors was, I was wrong, entirely wrong, and I said things that were—" He stopped. "I used my position to make you smaller, and I did it publicly. in front of staff who were watching how I treated you and learning from it. He looked at her. That's not something I can undo. No, she said. It isn't. He had clearly expected something more, a softening, an absolution, a version of it's all right that would let him close the loop. She didn't give it to him, not because she was angry, she wasn't particularly, she had metabolized too many versions of this to sustain fresh anger about one more, but because Britta was right. He should sit with it. I'm going to change how I run this floor, he said. It came out with the slight roughness of someone who means something and isn't quite sure they've earned the right to say it yet. The way I talk to staff, the assumptions I make. He paused. I don't know if that matters to you. It matters to the people on this floor, she said. So yes. He nodded. Dr. Vale. She leaned forward slightly. You're a skilled surgeon. You produce outcomes that are genuinely difficult to replicate. That's real, and it's worth something. She paused. It doesn't transfer to everything else. Expertise in one domain doesn't mean authority in another. You know that. You've always known it. You just stopped applying it to yourself. He was quiet for a moment. How do you do that? What? Say difficult things without, he made a vague gesture, without making it a weapon. She considered this. I've had a lot of practice saying the truth in rooms where people didn't want to hear it, she said. You get economical about it. He almost smiled. Again, the partial version, the one that didn't quite commit. Are you coming back to the floor? I haven't decided. I hope you do. He said it plainly. I think this floor needs you. She picked up her bag. I think this floor needs better systems and better leadership culture and probably a few conversations that are long overdue. She stood. Whether I'm here or not. She left him with that which was not cruel and was not kind and was simply true. And sometimes the truest thing you can offer someone is the one that doesn't make them feel better and doesn't make them feel worse, but gives them something accurate to work with. The official unsealing of Alexandra Carter's service record happened on a Tuesday, 6 weeks after the night at Mercy Crest. It was not a ceremony. It was paperwork, federal documentation filed through the appropriate channels, processed and approved and recorded, which was the unglamorous reality of how things that were hidden become visible again. She signed the relevant forms in a government office in Graywood, with Hale sitting 2 chairs away, not watching her, just present, which was what she needed. The operational record it revealed was not dramatic in its language. Military documents rarely were. It described, in the clipped formal syntax of official reporting, a classified extraction mission in which Lieutenant Alexandra Carter had demonstrated exceptional tactical judgment under hostile conditions and had been directly responsible for the survival of 3 personnel. It described the commendations that had been quietly filed and then sealed. It described, between the lines of what was formally stated, everything that had been true about her for years, and that precisely nobody in the Mercy Crest Trauma Department had been positioned to see. She read it once, closed the folder, and handed it back. You can keep a copy, Hale said. I know what it says. He looked at her for a moment. The congressional hearing is scheduled for the 14th. I know. Briggs will testify. Voss is chairing. They want you there. I'll be there. He nodded. Then, how are you? It was such a plain question that it took her a moment to receive it as the thing it was. Not tactical, not strategic, just a person asking another person about the condition of their interior life, which was the kind of question she had not been asked often enough in the years she had spent being useful in ways that required her to set the interior life to one side. I'm working on it, she said. That's an honest answer. I try. The hearing on the 14th was not televised in full, but the opening statements were, and the images that circulated afterward were the ones that stuck. Senator Voss at the head of the committee table, her voice controlled and precise as she laid out the scope of an 11-year fraud that had diverted resources from military personnel and resulted in the deaths of soldiers whose families had never received an accurate account of why. Warren Briggs at the witness table, pale but steady, delivering testimony that connected the abstract language of defense acquisition to specific operations and specific people in specific moments that were no longer classified and could now be said aloud. And in the gallery, visible in the wide-angle shots, not prominent, not performing visibility, a woman in civilian clothes who sat through the entire proceeding with the same stillness, she brought to every room she entered, watching the machinery of accountability do the slow, imperfect, necessary work that it was supposed to do. Roanne pleaded not guilty and was denied bail. Her trial was scheduled for the spring. Price's cooperation agreement was formally accepted. The 4 additional individuals identified through his testimony faced charges in 3 separate jurisdictions. The Defense Acquisition Fund restructuring that had been the technical vehicle for everything was suspended pending a full congressional audit that Voss's subcommittee would oversee. The soldiers from the under-supported operations, the ones who had not come back, whose families had been told stories that explained without truthfulness, were not brought back by any of this. That was the limitation of accountability, the part that did not resolve cleanly, the gap that remained even when justice ran its full course. Their names were entered into the official record of the hearing. Their families were notified by federal representatives that the full account of what had happened was now available to them. Some of them came to Washington, some of them didn't. Some of them had been carrying partial information for so long that the complete version arrived with a relief that was not separate from its grief. Alexandra understood that. She understood it personally, in the way you understand things that have left marks on you, and she did not try to resolve it into something simpler than it was. She went back to Mercy Crest on the 1st of the month, not under reassignment, not under any operational instruction. She went back because Britta had asked her directly and without ceremony whether she intended to return, and she had thought about it for 2 weeks and decided that the floor needed people who showed up not because they were performing something, but because the work was real and she was good at it, and those 2 facts together were reason enough. She worked the trauma floor. She managed her patients. She did the documentation and the handoffs and the IV placements and the early hours assessments that nobody else was awake to notice. She trained 2 new nurses on arterial line protocol with a directness that was efficient without being unkind, which was the approach she had always taken and which produced in both of them the kind of competence that came from being taught by someone who didn't waste their time. Okonkwo, the second-year resident who had fumbled the IV placement on her first night and who had handled the chaos of that night with genuine steadiness, stopped her in the corridor one morning to say that he had submitted a case study to a nursing and emergency medicine journal based on the incident response model from the night of the power failure, with her name, her full name, her real name, cited as the primary tactical decision-maker. He said it with the slightly nervous directness of someone who wasn't sure if it was the right thing and had decided to do it anyway. "Thank you," she said. "I didn't know," he said, "what you were, what you'd done. I want you to know that I'm sorry I didn't." "You treated me like a colleague," she said. "That's what you owed me." He thought about that. "And the rest of it?" "The rest of it wasn't yours to know." She paused. "But you showed up when it mattered. That's the part that counts." He nodded. He still looked like he wanted to say more, wanted to give the moment a shape that matched its weight. She let him sit with it, the way she had let Vale sit with his version of the same feeling, because sometimes the discomfort of not having words for something important was its own kind of knowledge. You carried it forward, and it changed how you operated. That was enough. What she had learned, what she had always known, but now carried differently, with the specific weight of having proved it again, was this. Power is not loud. The people who actually hold the line are rarely the ones in the center of the room. They are the ones in the corridor, in the stairwell, in the supply closet, running assessments in the dark, while someone with a better title tells them they don't belong. The world runs on the steadiness of people who do the necessary thing without waiting for permission or recognition, who carry enormous competence in forms that nobody has thought to measure, who absorb the small violences of being dismissed and do not let those violences determine the limit of what they offer. It does not make the dismissal acceptable. It does not make the arrogance of people like Vale, in his early version, a thing to be grateful for or forgiven easily. The cost of being invisible in the places where you have the most to contribute is a real cost. It accumulates. It shapes what people believe about themselves and what they allow themselves to reach for, and that damage is not erased by being vindicated at the end. But the vindication mattered. She was clear-eyed enough to say that. The truth surfacing mattered. The names in the record, the families with the accurate account, the network dismantled not cleanly but genuinely, it mattered. Not as a reward, not as compensation, as a consequence. The natural consequence of people who refuse to let the wrong version of events be the final one. She had been one of those people. She would continue to be. That was not a triumphant conclusion. It was just a choice, made again every day, to show up and do the work, and not mistake the difficulty of being underestimated for a reason to become less than what you were. It was, she had decided, enough of a reason. The ambulance bay doors opened on a cold morning in December, and somewhere in the city, the rain that had plagued Greywood for weeks had finally stopped, and the light was the kind that came after sustained bad weather, tentative, thin, but real. And Alexandra Carter walked onto the trauma floor of Mercy Crest Medical Center with a worn military duffel over her shoulder and her badge clipped to her chest, and absolutely no intention of being anything other than exactly what she was. Nobody laughed this time.